You think cowboys were just rugged men who died in high-noon duels, but the real enemy wasn't a bullet. It was a tiny scratch. They had mastered brutal, high-stakes techniques for dealing with infected limbs that saved thousands of lives in an era where a simple splinter could mean a slow, agonizing death. Here's the thing about frontier surgery that sounds completely backwards. Cutting off your own leg with a wood saw was often the only way to ensure you lived to see the next sunrise. Yeah, you heard that right. The Wild West was literally crawling with bacteria. But those dusty trail riders developed survival hacks that would make modern trauma surgeons shiver in their scrubs. The threat level on the frontier was about 10 times higher than what your body could handle without modern antibiotics. When you got a deep wound in the middle of the desert, your body didn't just start healing. It started a countdown to a shutdown. If the infection hit your bloodstream, your organs would panic and begin to fail one by one. It was like trying to stop a runaway train by standing on the tracks. Cowboys realized this the hard way during those long, lonely months on the trail. Back then, a camp was basically a dusty collection of bedrolls with zero medical equipment, so the hospital was usually a flat rock or a rickety table in a dimly lit, smoke-filled saloon. Doctors were rare, and smart doctors quickly learned that a sharp blade could stop death faster than any prayer or tonic. Stories spread through every outpost about men found crawling through the brush, their limbs turning a dark, sickly purple, while surrounded by endless miles of empty prairie. These weren't just scary campfire tales. They were grim warnings about the price of hesitation. Clean surgical tools became more valuable than gold nuggets because that's exactly what they were. Tools for survival. Seriously, cowboys would guard a sharp Bowie knife like a treasure chest because it was their only insurance policy against a rotting wound that could kill them in days. But here is where things got really creative. They started developing tricks that would make a modern bioengineer impressed by their sheer resourcefulness. After learning that an infected limb was basically liquid death, cowboys had to get creative fast. Their first instinct? Look at the bottom of a whiskey bottle and pray for strength. But they couldn't just get drunk and hope for the best like a bunch of confused amateurs. Smart frontier crews rigged up elaborate surgical environments using whatever they had on hand. Saddle blankets and leather straps became giant tourniquets, stretched tight across the patient's thigh to stop the flow of blood before the first cut was ever made. Tourniquets were the difference between a successful procedure and a funeral. The trick was positioning the leather strap just right so the blood flow would stop completely, instead of just spurting uselessly onto the dirt floor. Makes sense, right? But here's where it gets interesting, though. Cowboys soon discovered that using a dirty saw was like trying to heal a wound with a rusted nail that had been soaking in swamp water for a month. Gross. So they developed a fire washing routine, heating their blades until they were glowing red before any amputation attempt began. This meant precious time and fuel spent on preparation, but it was worth it to avoid that nasty black rot that followed a dirty cut. Then there were the saloons. Frontier towns became surprisingly good at improvised medicine, creating surgical theaters out of bar counters and using crates of supplies for leverage. These makeshift systems could funnel enough whiskey into a man to keep him from screaming while the lid man prepared the saw. Some crews got so good at this that they could complete a full limb removal in under 60 seconds. But wait, it gets even weirder. When whiskey wasn't enough to dull the pain, desperate cowboys turned to a technique that sounds like pure madness, the shock cautery. They didn't just cut the limb. They used fire to seal the soul back into the body. When the blade was finished, the real problem began: how to stop the patient from bleeding out in seconds. Desperate cowboys turned to the most metal solution imaginable: fire and chemistry. They would soak a piece of cloth in high-proof alcohol and light it, or more commonly, they'd use a white-hot branding iron. This wasn't just about torturing the poor soul on the table. It was accidental genius. The intense heat would instantly sear the flesh and blood vessels, creating a permanent seal that acted like nature's own medical glue. The charred surface grabbed onto the tissue, effectively shutting down the leaks before the heart could pump the body dry. Think of it as the world's first thermal sealing system, invented by guys who spent their days branding cattle. Cowboys noticed that their fire-treated wounds stayed closed longer and didn't attract as many flies. Instead of turning into a weeping, open mess after just a few hours, this seared tissue could last weeks while the body slowly began to recover. The burnt skin didn't just stop the bleeding, it actually slowed down the growth of the invisible monsters we now call bacteria. What makes this even more amazing is that those cowboys accidentally stumbled onto a concept we still use today in high-tech surgical theaters. Modern surgeons use electrocautery for the exact same reasons. That burnt wood effect on the skin changes the cellular structure, filtering out potential infections and adding a layer of protection. Cowboys weren't trying to be fancy scientists. They just wanted a leg that wouldn't kill them. The searing method spread quickly among trail bosses because it actually saved lives. Word travels fast when you find something that keeps your best ranch hand from dying of a basic infection. Captains of the trail started ordering their men to carry specific cautery irons before long cattle drives. But even this clever trick had its limits. Charred skin still couldn't perform miracles if the wound was already deep with rot, and the process used up precious whiskey and firewood. Cowboys needed a backup plan for when fire wasn't enough. Then there's something even more surprising that they discovered about keeping a wound fresh. They found that letting nature's own scavengers into their bandages created almost magical results that seemed impossible to believe. While the less experienced men were busy cursing their luck and looking at their swollen limbs, a few clever survivors discovered something fascinating: the power of the maggot. Tossing live larvae into a wound wasn't just a gross coincidence, it was accidental genius. Those wriggling little bugs weren't there for luck, they were there for survival. Here is what happened. Cowboys noticed that wounds containing certain maggots stayed cleaner and didn't smell like a rotting carcass after a week on the trail. Makes sense, right? Well, those cowboys didn't know they were dealing with one of nature's most powerful biological surgeons. Maggots kill bacteria. Not some of them, but most of the bad ones. Modern science proves this works because maggots only eat dead, necrotic tissue, basically performing a precision microsurgery that a human with a rusty knife could never achieve. The bugs would eat the rot and leave the healthy flesh alone, effectively cleaning the wound before the infection could multiply. Cowboys stumbled onto this centuries before anyone understood that germs existed. They just knew their legs lasted longer when they let the trail medics do their job at the bottom of the bandage. But here's the weird part. Some survivors swore their maggot-treated wounds healed faster and felt cooler too, less like they were being eaten by a fire from the inside out. Cowboys would argue over which flies produced the best doctors, with the green bottle fly being a popular choice, though nobody could explain exactly why. Maybe the green ones were more aggressive eaters, or maybe it was just cowboy psychology at work. The really smart trail bosses actually harvested maggots, specifically for wound treatment. When food ran low and the sun was brutal, they'd keep their little bug surgeons in a cool tin. Gold could run out and horses could die, but a clean wound was life or death. Real treasure meant staying alive long enough to spend your wages at the end of the trail. Then there's the practical side. Maggots were easy to find when you were miles from civilization. Unlike other medicines that spoiled or ran out, bugs stayed bugs. Cowboys could find their surgeons on any piece of old meat, rinse them off in a bit of creek water, and toss them into a fresh bandage. Recycling at its finest. Modern hospitals actually still use medical-grade maggots today for the same biological debridement properties. Those desperate cowboys accidentally discovered something that high-tech medicine uses in extreme cases today. Not bad for guys who thought a bath was a yearly event. Of course, the maggot trick wasn't perfect. It couldn't fix a wound that had already gone systemic. It worked best as a cleaning agent, not a miracle cure for a bullet in the gut. Smart survivors learned to apply their bug doctors immediately, not wait until the limb was completely black. The maggot trick spread through the frontier camps faster than a rumor about a new gold strike. Trail bosses who ignored this method often found themselves dealing with sick crews and men demanding the bug treatment to save their limbs. But even maggots had their limits when the winter hit and the flies disappeared. That's when cowboys needed something even more dramatic than bugs and irons. While bugs and fire helped keep wounds clean, they still faced their biggest nightmare: the internal infection that fire couldn't touch. That's when the craftiest survivors turned to what sounds like pure alchemy, the black powder sear. The process called for a literal explosion inside the wound. It wasn't new, but cowboys had to get creative with gunpowder and a steady hand. Pour the powder into the deep wound, light a match, and boom, the heat and pressure would seal the internal vessels. Simple in theory, but absolutely brutal in practice when you're shaking from blood loss on a moving wagon with limited supplies. One of the most successful trail leaders actually ordered a special powder kit to be kept in the lead wagon at all times. His crew thought he was crazy until they realized this explosion could save their lives during those endless months away from a town. The setup used high-quality rifle powder poured into the cavity of the amputation site with a leather bit positioned for the patient to bite on. But here is where it gets interesting and dangerous. These powder sears needed constant attention because one wrong spark could turn a medical procedure into a tragic accident. Cowboys had to balance keeping the powder dry enough to flash while not blowing off more than they intended. Talk about high-stakes cooking. The fuel problem was massive, too. Every grain of powder used for surgery was powder that couldn't be used for hunting or defense against outlaws. Some crews got so desperate they started using ground-up match heads or even dried pine sap, anything that would generate a fast, intense flash of heat. The smell must have been absolutely terrible. Burnt hair, sulfur, and seared meat. Then there's the speed issue nobody talks about. These homemade flashes happened in a split second, but the preparation took hours. And we're talking about a thirsty crew of 20 men, needing every hand just to hold the patient down while the surgeon aimed the match. A wounded man needed incredible grit just to survive the preparation, let alone stay conscious through the flash itself. Smart cowboys learned to time their surgeries perfectly. They'd wait for the cool of the evening when the patient's fever might dip, making it easier to manage the delicate powder pour. Some crews even took turns standing guard to keep the flies away during the process. The lead balls they used for the bite block often came from the very pistols that caused the trouble in the first place. Ironic that their deadly ammunition literally became their lifeline during the surgery. Cowboys discovered that lid was soft enough to be bitten without breaking teeth, but strong enough to keep the jaw from locking during the pain. Of course, the powder sear wasn't their only trick. When the powder was damp or the wind was too high, they had to get even more creative with their survival methods. While gunpowder and fire were clever solutions, cowboys didn't stop there. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and some crews got downright weird with their wound-saving tricks. The most popular backup plan involved using a pressure paste made from cobwebs and wood ash to stop the leaks. Now, this wasn't about being superstitious, though that was probably a nice side effect. Cowboys discovered that mixing a bit of spider silk into the wound actually helped the blood clot faster than just using a dry rag. The silk acted like a natural scaffolding, keeping the precious blood inside the body for longer stretches on the trail. Smart, right? But silk wasn't the only weapon in their arsenal. Some crews swore by adding a vinegar wash to their surgical sites. Vinegar's acidic bite didn't just mask the horrible smell of a healing wound. It actually fought off the nasty microbes that we now know cause sepsis. Cowboys would also toss in crushed charcoal when they could get it, or whatever bitter herbs they could find growing near the trail. Prickly pear cactus, sagebrush, anything that might cover up the funky smells brewing under those leather bandages. Then there were the really desperate packing attempts. Picture a cowboy trying to stuff a deep wound with layers of dry moss stuffed into old flour sacks. Some crews used pieces of raw hide as makeshift patches, believing the animal's toughness would transfer to the man. Did it work? Sometimes. Was it pretty gross? Absolutely. It was the original duct tape of the medical world. The weirdest concoction had to be what some trail riders called cactus coffee. This bizarre drink mixed weak whiskey, questionable water, and whatever random roots they could dig up from the desert floor. Sassafras, dandelion, even ground-up willow bark. Anything to make their survival situation more bearable. It probably tasted like liquid dirt, but it was better than dying of thirst or fever. Of course, not every experiment ended well. Some cowboys tried using river mud or clay-lined pots for their wound care, thinking the earth would draw out the poison. What they didn't know was that the mud was often full of new bacteria. Cowboys would get sicker, weaker, and more confused without understanding why their natural remedy was actually killing them. The trial-and-error approach cost lives, but it also led to genuine discoveries that were passed down through generations of frontiersmen. Cowboys were basically mobile trauma units, testing wild theories about survival while fighting for their lives on the open range. While these makeshift solutions kept many men alive, the most innovative cowboys were already working on something far more ambitious. Some trail bosses were experimenting with techniques that went way beyond simple cutting and burning. They were developing methods that could actually prevent the infection from starting in the first place through surprisingly advanced grit medicine. When regular fire wasn't cutting it, they got creative with animal tendons. These tough, stretchy fibers made perfect waterproof sutures for closing up a major amputation site. They'd soak a tendon in whiskey, pull it thin, then use it to stitch the skin shut in a tight, protective seal. The heat of the body would cause the tendon to shrink slightly, pulling the wound even tighter. It was a slow-motion closure that worked even when the patient was being jostled in a moving wagon. This method took incredible patience and a very steady hand, but it worked even when fuel for fire was scarce. Then there is the willow bark tea trick that sounds almost too modern to be true. Cowboys noticed that chewing on certain types of willow bark actually helped keep the fever down and the pain manageable after a major surgery. They'd mix the bark with water and leave it to steep, creating a natural painkiller that we now know contains the primary ingredient in aspirin. The process wasn't perfect, but it reduced the inflammation enough to keep a man from going into a fatal shock. Nature's own pharmacy was basically hidden in plain sight along the riverbanks. Let's not forget about those massive iron wagon wheels sitting around doing nothing during the camp rest. Experienced trail bosses figured out they could use the friction from the spinning wheels to sharpen their surgical blades to a razor edge in seconds. They'd run the steel against the moving iron, then heat the metal over the fire. A sharper blade meant a faster cut, and a faster cut meant less chance of the patient dying from the sheer physical trauma. Who knew wagon parts could save lives through surgical precision? And the weirdest part is what happened when crews reached higher, colder mountain passes. Cowboys developed emergency ice pack techniques that were surprisingly sophisticated for the time. They'd collect mountain snow, which naturally slows down blood flow and numbs the nerves, and pack it around the limb before the first cut was made. This frozen prep was almost like a primitive form of local anesthesia, just waiting to be used. Some crews built special leather snow boots specifically for this purpose. These advanced methods separated the amateur trail riders from the true survival experts who knew how to use the environment. While city folks worried about finding the right tonic at the local apothecary, seasoned cowboys were mastering biology and physics without even knowing it. They turned their camps into mobile emergency rooms where every experiment could mean the difference between a funeral and a ride home. The most successful frontier crews weren't just good at riding horses. They were brilliant at staying alive through grit, determination, and some seriously clever survival wizardry. They proved that when you're 500 miles from a hospital, the only thing between you and the grave is your own ingenuity and a very sharp knife.